In this video, let's talk about server and client architecture. Let's just see how we work with databases, because a lot of times, even on day one of your job, the request that comes to you would be connect to this database. So let's talk about what does that mean. When somebody tells you, hey, connect to this database, what does that mean? So what is the architecture like? So it's a good general knowledge to have. So I wanted to cover it before we actually start using those tools, because the tools we're using, they're literally this architecture. We have a server, we have a client, and we're going to install both those things and have them talk to each other. So what does that mean? So I just want to quickly cover that. Okay, it's going to be short and it's going to be all slides. So hang with me, put that 1.5x, 2x, and watch the video in a higher speed. All right, client server architecture. So what does that mean? So basically we have the client and we have the server. Bam, done, right? So a client is as our computer or whatever software we use to connect to the database server. A server is where the actual magic is happening, where the data is stored, where the data is being managed. That DBMS, database management system, right? MySQL, the MySQL server will be running on some computer. In our case, we're going to run it on our laptop. Our laptop is a computer. We can treat it as a server. A server is nothing but a computer, except it doesn't have a monitor, it doesn't have an audio card and things like that. But it is a computer. It has CPU, it has memory, and a bunch of other things. Okay, so the database software, the MySQL, needs to run on some kind of software, on some kind of machine, some kind of hardware, and whoever is using it as humans or our software itself needs to connect to that and be able to basically retrieve data or send data to that. So we need a client. The client is the way for us to connect to that server. And there's a lot of different tools for that. So you can have multiple clients, multiple servers, and you can be in one client connecting to each one of those. So the client we're going to use is called MySQL Workbench. We're going to use Workbench. It's the most popular client. If we're using in Python, in our Python code, we're going to use some kind of client, right? There's a MySQL connector, PyMySQL at the end of the day is using the connector. If you're using a Java, there's some kind of JDBC connector, a bunch of different clients built by different people. So in this slide, what we're trying to say is we might have multiple databases, and from my computer, I'm going to be able to connect to them. Just using that tool, I'm going to create multiple connections. That's just how database works. Let's say you have an e-commerce software, right? And that software would have a database to store your product information, right? The inventory, availability, the size of the product, color of the product, whatever you're selling, information about that might be in some kind of database. Another database can be to store your user information. You're an e-commerce site, you have users coming in and registering, placing orders and things like that. That information about the user, email address, phone number, address, anything that has to do with the user, that might be in a different database. Sure, it could be in the same database, but that's really bad practice. You want to put the user information in a different database. Then you might have an order information, right? Customers come and place orders, and you have a lot of information about orders, about taxes, anything that has to do with the order itself. You might want to track that in a whole different database. So just these three examples are three different databases. And let's say you are a developer in that company, in that e-commerce company, or you are a QA person in that company. Now you need to look at all those databases, because whenever you're working with users, you need to connect to the user database. Whenever you're trying to look into products, you need to connect to the products database. Whenever you're trying to deal with orders, you need to connect to the orders database so you can get information. So, but you're not going to have multiple clients. You're going to have one client. You're going to have your laptop. You're going to have a client installed, Workbench in our case, and you're going to create a connection to the different servers. Okay, so that's what this slide is meant to show. I just want to show you the idea of you have different database servers. They might have different URLs, different IP addresses. They might be in the same URL, meaning the same machine, the same IP address, but different ports. That is all configured in a whole, there's so many different ways. Most likely they have their own IP addresses. They're different machines. You want to keep them separate because something goes wrong, right? Let's say you have the product database here, and you also have the customers in the same database. You upload some kind of product catalog and you break stuff. The database goes bad. Now, just because you have issues with your products, do you want the users to be affected? Do you want users not to be able to log in? They're not able to look at their old history. They're not able to basically do anything just because you have product issues. You don't, right? You want to isolate that. You want the product stuff to be its own. So in case something goes wrong with your products while you're fixing it, users can still log in. Users can still look at their history. You're not just going to totally paralyze your users. So keeping them separate in a different database actually helps. And a lot of times the bottleneck for all your applications is databases. It's the most heavy operation whenever you talk to databases. So that's why you want to keep it separate. That's kind of a side note, not really related to the architecture, but that's why you want to, just some good knowledge. If somebody asks you why do you want to keep databases separate, user database versus product database, because if something goes wrong, you don't want to kill both of them at the same time. If they're on the same machine and something goes wrong, both of them will go down, and you don't want that. All right, so this is basically what I just said. Every server would have its own IP address, meaning the location. An IP address is like a physical address, but it's for computers. Every computer has its own IP address, and the client is going to connect to that server using the IP address. At the end of the day, that's what's happening. And then you can have multiple clients connecting to the same server. Think about the e-commerce application that I just talked about, right? You might have 10 developers. All 10 of them are going to talk to the product database. All 10 of us is going to talk to the, user database. And all of us are going to talk to the order database. So you have a database server. You have 3 of them running. Well, let's talk about just one of them, the product server. Every engineer is going to make a connection. All of us have clients on our laptops. We're going to be able to make a connection to it. Now, there is a limit. It's a high number, how many connections you are, and it's a configuration. Because the more connections you have, the more load you're going to create on the server. So you want to control it. You don't want to like unlimited connection to it. You do want to control it. And then there are people that manage that. It's a setting how many connections you can have at a given time to that server. But it is possible for multiple clients to be connected to one server. All right, so the way, actually, this is something we would do because we want to save money or something like that. You would have one server, meaning one IP address, and you can have multiple database servers installed on there. So a database server is a software that you just install. And the server I'm talking about in this case, like this image, is a hardware. It's a computer, right? You rent one computer. What I do is for all my projects is I just go to DigitalOcean and I rent it for $6 a month. It's a virtual computer, but it's not that big. It has one memory. For $6 a month, it's 1 gigabyte of memory. I can't do a whole lot of things, but for testing applications and just for testing databases, it's good enough. So I do something like that. So I get one server. When I rent one server, that server has one address, right? It's one machine, one IP address. That's it. So I pay $6 a month, let's say, and I have one machine. But in that one machine, I want to install multiple different database servers. So the way I would do it is, since they have the same address, I'm going to change the port number. So when you have a computer, when you install software, the address for that software will be the address to the computer. But inside of that computer, there is ports. One application could be listening to one port, another application could be listening to another port. Think of it like a big building, like a mall, right? The mall has one address, but inside of the mall, there's a bunch of small stores, and each store have this own number. So let's say you go to the mall at 123 Main Street. Okay, that's the address of the mall, and inside of it there are 4 stores. There's store number 1, store number 2, store number 3, store number 3, number 4. So now, if you want to go to store number 3, you would have to go to door number 3. You have to look at the number. It's the same address, but the door is number 3. So on the computer, think of it that way. You have a big computer. It has one address, IP address 127.0.1. That's actually local host, right? Once you get to that computer, now you have different applications. They have different doors, and those doors are ports. So there is port 3306, 3307. There's thousands of them. There is 64,000 ports. 64,000 ports in there, but not all of them are open. You cannot use all of them. There's a range where you can use. There's a range that are reserved for special things. Anyways, I'm getting too much into detail, but think of it like a mall and a bunch of stores makes sense. So if you want to run multiple MySQL servers, you're going to have them running on one computer, all 3 of them, let's say 3, but each one will need a different port, basically a different door. So you can run multiple servers, multiple MySQL servers, but each one of them will use a different port. I went a little far, but I think that analogy of understanding IP address versus port would make sense. Just think of a mall every time that comes up, okay? Your laptop is a computer, right? and you have an address. Whenever you want to, like, let's say you open a browser and you want to connect to your laptop, you go to this port, 120, this IP, 127.0.0.1. That means local. That's the IP address of your computer. Or you can literally type out localhost. You can literally write localhost. That is the address to your laptop. So on your laptop, if you want to install multiple MySQLs, then each one is going to have to run in a different port. I actually have that set up on my laptop. I have a direct install. I installed MySQL 8 directly on my laptop, and it's running on 3306. Then I installed a MAMP. That is a package. We're going to do that right after this. Actually, we're going to do, maybe not right after this, 2 videos or so. We're going to install MAMP. When we install MAMP, it's a MySQL server that comes with it. It's a package that has a bunch of things. MySQL server is inside of it. Now 3306 is being used. Think of it as a mall, and one of the doors there is a store. Another store cannot exist in that door. Another store can exist in that address, but not in that door, so not in that port. So on my computer, I have one MySQL sitting there, and it's listening to 3306. Basically, think of it as it's connected to 3306. No other application can connect to 3306. That's it. The 3306 is being used. Nobody else can use it. Now I bring MAMP and I install MAMP, try to run MySQL. MySQL is going to say, hey, I want to use 3306, but you can't because the other MySQL is using it. So in MAMP, I'm going to configure the port to use a different one. And in this case, I'm going to use 8889. Remember, there's thousands of them. 8889 is going to use. Then if I want to install another MySQL, again, some other way, maybe another direct install or XAMPP or some other Docker or something like that, then I would use a whole different port. So you can add a lot of them, but different ports. But again, you can't do unlimited because they're all using your laptop's power. They're all using your laptop CPU, your laptop's memory. Eventually, you're going to start to run out of resources. But the idea is same IP address. If you want to run multiple servers, you would use multiple ports. You don't see this in production a lot because you're going to get different servers which has different IP addresses. But locally, if you want to install multiple MySQL instances, that's what you're going to do. You're going to play with the port numbers. So whenever you're trying to connect to a server, so this whole conversation is about being able to connect, right? You have the server, you have the client. The client is going to connect to the server. You're going to need a user to be able to connect to that, right? There is a user, just like you logging into a website. When you log into a website, you need a password and a user. This is pretty much it. You are connecting to a database server. You need a user and a password to connect to it. Sometimes you don't need a password. It depends how it's configured. You might have just a user without a password. You can configure it that way. So you connect to it as a user, and that user is going to have privileges. So the database, imagine, it's a lot of data, a lot of important information. So when you connect to it as a user, that user needs specific privileges. You might be a root user that has all privileges. The root user can write, root user can read. But when you create a user, for example, at a company, if you have a production server, if a production database server, you're never going to get, as a human, you're never going to get a write access to production. They might give you a user, but you're going to be a read-only access. Even that is very rare. And for production, they don't. They will have a replica, a copy of it, and they will give you a read access to the replica, not to the master. So anyways, the user would have specific, and you can control that privileges. You can say the user can write into this schema, but cannot write into that schema. The user can do delete, but the user cannot do insert, or the other way around. The user can do this things to this resources. So you can literally control a lot about that user. So you're going to need to know what privileges the user needs to have. Locally, when we work with our databases, we have root, so it has all the privileges. We don't really have to create an additional user. But for your application, for your automation, you might need to create additional user that has limited restrictions on what it can do, so you don't damage things. All right, so when we're talking about connecting to a database, there's a database server somewhere, and we talk about connect to it. How do you connect to it? Either IP address or address. An address always, or a name, always converts to an IP address, right? When you go to facebook.com, the server is not called facebook.com. Server computer does not know what a facebook.com is, but in the middle, there's another kind of servers called DNS, domain name system, which will take the domain name, facebook.com, and you will figure out, oh, facebook.com belongs to this IP address, right? Then you will send it. So computers only have IP addresses. Computers don't have names. They have IP addresses, but there is a technology in the middle that will take a name and we'll figure out, oh, this name means this IP address. It will route it to there. So same with databases. So when you go to a work the first day of job, they might say, connect to this database. And when they tell you to connect to the database, they have to provide you the address of the database. Where am I connecting to? And what is the user that I'm connecting to? And what is the port I'm connecting to, right? Those three information you needed. So they might give you a name like this. For example, you have a website called My Site. So they might say, oh, the dev database is located as dev.db.mysite.com. The production is prod.db.mysite.com. They might give you a name like this, or they might give you an IP address, specific IP address. But 99% of the time, they're going to give you a name for it, because the IP can change. If they take the data, put it on a different machine, the IP can change, but the name would always the same. They just change where this name points to. So normally you would get a name like this, and you will get a user and a password. You're going to need those things. So the dev instance, we have a website. You have, remember we talked about environments. One website will have multiple environments. You have the dev database, the production database. The structure will be the same. The name of the tables, how many tables there are, will be the same, but the data will be different. But production will have production users, production data. Dev would have all kinds of basically garbage, all kinds of stuff that you're going to, as you're developing, like all fake data and things like that. But the structure will be the same. If you want to change the structure, if you want to introduce a new table, if you want to introduce a new column or something like that, you first make the change on the dev server. You make the changes here, right? You change the table, you create the table, whatever. You test the application. Then you go to production and you make the changes in the production database. Then you release the code. That's normally how it works. Okay. So that was I feel like that was a good explanation of just understanding there's a server somewhere. You are the client. You use a client tool like Workbench or CLI to connect to that server and be able to read and write to that server. So that is all I have for you guys at this point. I think after this is going to be mostly hands-on. So let's get to it and start learning SQL.